Hi, this lesson is an introduction to topic F3, time and change. There are two key parts to this topic. The first part looks at fossils. The second part looks at dating of rocks. But I want us to start by looking at fossils. Fossils are incredibly useful geological evidence. The first component of this is to be able to identify a fossil, like we can see here. But that, for us as geologists, is just the start, because it's then what we can interpret from that fossil that really makes them such useful geological evidence. This is an interesting example, a fairly recent find from the University of Manchester. What we have here is a bedding surface of rock. And if we look carefully at it, we can actually see this very strange trackway, this line or groove that's been imprinted onto what at the time would have been soft mud. If we follow that groove along, at the end of it, we find an ammonite fossil. This is where, if you like, the last journey of this organism, as it's been dragged perhaps by a current along the seabed before the animal itself finally dies and becomes incorporated into the sediment. It shows perhaps that fossils give us huge amounts of information about environments, about time, about evolution, about plate tectonics, about all sorts of different aspects of how the Earth works. All rolled together in this sort of sub-subject within geology we call paleontology. So let's have a look at what we actually are talking about when we're looking at fossils. Fossil comes from a Latin word, the word fossus, and that means literally having been dug up. A fossae, for example, is a ditch in Latin. A fossil itself is defined as the remains of a once living organism, or some evidence of their activity. Let's have a look at breaking that down a little bit. Now, there is a definition that we add to that, which says that to be a fossil, it must be more than 10,000 years old. Or to put it another way, to have lived before the end of the last glacial period, the last ice age. Less than that, we talk about a subfossil. Now, perhaps it's just because I'm a quaternary geologist myself. I'm perhaps less hung up on this definition than other people. For me, it's more about the evidence of past life and past activity that really are key to making it a fossil. You know, the distinction between these two examples of a spruce tree that's dated to just over 11,000 years ago and a human fossil from a peat bog, which is, 1,800 years old maybe? I don't see the massive distinction between them, and it's certainly not one we should worry about. There are two types of fossils that we need to deal with perhaps slightly differently. The first of these is a body fossil. Now, a body fossil is some part of an organism's anatomy that's been preserved in the rocks. Now, typically these are things like teeth, bones, shells, horns. In plants, it could be leaves or branches or roots or trunks of trees. Some part of an organism's body that gets preserved. Now, it could be preserved as an imprint of that, but it's the body itself that we see a record of within the rock. Most of the fossils we deal with are body fossils. But they're not the only type. We also see a group of fossils we call trace fossils. Now, a trace fossil is a record of an organism's activity. An imprint it left as it lived. Now, there's a huge range of these. I've listed some of them here. Burrows or tracks or footprints are perhaps the best known. But it could also include things like teeth marks. For human fossils, stone implements are an important piece of evidence. Even gastroliths, the stones that dinosaurs ate to help them grind up their food. All of these are fossils, and these again can give us some crucial bits of evidence about past life. Some of the more famous examples of this include things like coprolites. These are fossilized dung, feces preserved in the rocks. You can see there's a whole range of these things, on ones that give useful information about an animal's diet or how it actually digested its food. Now, different types of fossils are preserved in different ways, depending on what their body is made from. It's an idea we call preservation potential. We'll talk more about this in another lesson, but where we see organisms that have hard parts, so things like skeletons in a vertebrate or teeth, okay, are most likely to preserve. They're the most resistant things to all the processes that can happen to an organism following or even during death. To a lesser extent, you can get other things preserved in more exceptional circumstances. Hair and skin imprints, horn, that type of thing. For invertebrates, these are animals without backbones. These are perhaps the most common fossils that we find. And there are particular bits of fossils that are more likely to preserve. So insects, for example, an incredibly common, incredibly diverse group, their exoskeleton is made of a material called chitin. Now, chitin is relatively robust, particularly if there's no oxygen around. It does tend to break down in aerobic environments. Graptolites, a group of fossils that we're going to be looking at for dating. Their bodies are made of called a scleroprotein, which is a bit like fingernail material. Now that can preserve, again, predominantly in anaerobic environments. But the most common preservation we see for invertebrates is in the shells. Shelled organisms, small invertebrates with these hard shells are most likely to preserve. And they're the most frequent fossils that we look at in our course. Usually a calcium carbonate, either calcite or a slightly different form of calcite called aragonite, form this hard outer shell that stands a reasonably good chance of being preserved. So bivalves, brachiopods, trilobites, corals all have this type of structure. Less commonly, we do see some invertebrates that have a shell or a skeleton made of silica, sponges or microfossils called radiolera. We don't really study these in too much depth, but they do exist and they do preserve. Plants too will preserve. In particular, cellulose or lignin, which is sort of the woody part of trees and of plants, that can preserve in particular environments. So, to conclude, fossils give us a huge amount of information that supplements what we find already within the rocks about the age of those rocks, the environment in which they were deposited, the conditions that existed on Earth, and also the history of life on Earth, how life has evolved in response to changing geological situations. For us as geologists, it's really important that we understand what the fossils are telling us. So we need to understand more about the fossil record. But that's for another lesson. I'll see you then.